Welcome back to News Talk and our conversations time with D.C. Council Chairman Phil Mendelson. Can you talk about where things stand regarding the mayor's plan to close D.C. General and to provide services to homeless families, particularly during the winter time at newer facilities across the city? Some residents want to know how the facility in their ward or their neighborhood was chosen, and I know some of your colleagues, given the costs associated with acquiring parcels that the city doesn't now have, the financial impact of this is a concern for your colleagues. So, big picture, where do things stand?
Big picture is I expect we're going to move forward with the legislation in this month or next, and that the fundamentals of the mayor's proposal are going to be supported by the council, I think, unanimously. And those fundamentals are that we're going to replace the D.C. General shelter, which has roughly 270 units, with scattered units throughout the city. The mayor had proposed, if I remember correctly, it was 6 wards, and that we will approve legislation for 6 wards of scattered facilities. I know there have been some discussions. I've begun some discussions with the executive about problems with a couple of the sites where zoning issues could tie it up forever. And there also is concern with regard to the economics and whether there's a better way that we could pursue having these shelters, not just leasing them at very expensive terms, but for looking at whether there are alternatives on the financing.
What do you envision in terms of bringing some of the costs down?
Well, what I really envision is working with the executive to see if we can come up with 6 shelters. I always hesitate, but I think it's 6, because there was one ward that was already an existing shelter, and the other is, Ward 1 is a replacement for an existing shelter. So that leaves 6. What I envision is working with the executive to see if we can find, not find, but have a package of 6. But there might be, I'm sure there'll be some changes to what the mayor proposed.
When residents say, how did you choose the site down the street from where I live, or in my neighborhood, or in my ward, do you hear NIMBYism? And do you hear understandable NIMBYism, or given that we're not talking about criminals here, or people who might, have serious drug problems, where maybe there's a concern about theft because people presumably need money for their next fix, their next hit. We're talking about people who just need a place to live.
We're talking about families.
So is it? So
we're talking about homeless families.
So what? So does it? Is it the sort of NIMBYism that you sort of get, or is it the sort of NIMBYism where you're like, come on, we're better than this?
I'm not sure how to answer that, because while I know that there's been some objection by neighbors to some of the proposed sites, I really think that's kind of the minority of the concerns that council members have been dealing with.
Right, but I'm talking about the resident reaction.
Yeah, I think the greater issue is this: where there are zoning changes required, that speaks to, in essence, there being an inappropriateness to the site. The zoning regulations have already determined what's appropriate for different areas, different zones within the city. And so like one zone is appropriate for single-family housing, another for high-density commercial. It's already made that determination. And a couple of instances...
But just in terms of what's happening, don't you think some of it is, we don't want certain people in our neighborhood kind of thing? And that the zoning is a very nice... I mean, zoning is important, but some of it is, how do we fight back against this in a way that doesn't make us seem small? Oh, zoning. Let's claim it as a zoning dispute, when the reality is...
I think that's only a very small piece of it. Yeah, there's some folks who just don't want homeless folks in their neighborhood. I think that's a very, very small piece of it. But when you talk about putting a shelter for 50 families in an industrial neighborhood where you have a bus parking lot on one side and you have a trash transfer station a block away and you have a marijuana cultivation building next door, I think that arguing whether that's appropriate, because the zoning doesn't allow for residential in an industrial zone. So zoning is not an excuse. Zoning speaks to, a warehouse district is a warehouse district. It's not where people live. And a single-family district is a single-family district. It's not where you put apartment buildings. And you can try to gloss over that, but what it is then what you, when I say you, I don't mean you, Bruce DuPoy, what you're doing is you're saying you're challenging what has already been determined to be appropriate. And I mean, so I'm saying all this by way of responding to your question, which is, isn't zoning just an excuse for NIMBYism for people who don't want homeless folks? No, it's not. But the bottom line here is that I believe that all of the council members, not just the majority, support having these smaller shelters in all of the wards. And while there's been some issue with a couple of the sites, I don't believe there's an issue with the majority of the sites, and that we're going to move legislation in the next month or two.
That would be significant because the mayor in her interview here this week said, "This is probably the toughest thing I'll do as mayor."
I don't know that I want to argue yes or no on that, but the big hurdle she's already overcome, and that is convincing people that we should have smaller shelters scattered around the city. She's already made that case and won it.
Let's talk about statehood for the District of Columbia and full congressional representation. We've seen efforts to make the people you represent, 600,000, eventually to be 700,000 residents of the District of Columbia, more than some states, make them full and complete equal citizens with the people who live in the 50 states. We've seen efforts come and go. You know, the odometer goes up and it goes down again, and nothing really changes. Does this feel to you like a new moment?
Yeah, it does feel like a new moment. I'm not quite sure what that means. A lot of moments feel like new moments. The mayor has put forth
more sophisticated, more savvy, somewhat more likely to succeed.
It's a new and different strategy, and I think it's important because it will help push the needle. What's behind the mayor's proposal, and she's working with the 3 elected shadow representatives, as well as others at the Wilson Building. The fundamental is that she wants to present the new president and the new Congress with something, a package, if you will, which would be a new constitution, a new petition, voter referendum behind it that says we want statehood. And that's been lacking. We haven't done anything like this since the 1980s. Will this make the difference? Don't know. But there's no question there'll be a new president. And there's a lot of speculation that the new president will be Democrat, and the Democrats have been more favorable to the district. There will be a new Congress, and possibly a Democratic Congress, maybe.
Does buy-in from the residents of the city, beyond the 100 people who you can always count on to show up for a rally, does that matter? And do you think you can get to a point where where more people will involve themselves, speak up, show up, do the things that all successful political and civil rights battles have if they end in victory?
Well, you do reference a good point, and that is that we've never seen the outrage taken to the streets that we've seen with, for instance, the civil rights movement in the 60s. And that would make a difference. It also would make a difference if we did much more outside of the city, working with the other states. And when I say working with, I really should say working on or working in the other states, because ultimately there's got to be buy-in across the country, whether it's getting Congress to support statehood or some of the other initiatives that we've done that were incremental, like having voting representative in the House. There's got to be buy-in outside of the district. But the thing is that I think after a while the same old approach becomes a bit what do I want to say? It becomes, I don't want to say boring, but I guess that's what I'm trying not to say. And so doing something new and different, which is what the mayor's proposing, which is we're going to have a referendum. We haven't had one of those in decades. And so that's a statement from the citizens. And we'll have a new document we can present to Congress. So we're not just saying give us statehood, but actually here's the Constitution. That pushes the ball.
I want to use our remaining time, Mr. Chairman, to talk about the D.C. Trust. I guess it was formerly known as the D.C. Youth Investment Trust, and it was a way
Children's Youth Investment Trust
Children's, of course. Thank you. And so they had monies that they could distribute to entities that would do good works in the community to benefit young people, right? And they generated a lot of the wrong sort of headlines back in the Harry Thomas era. because monies, to put it mildly, didn't go where they should have, right? You would think all of that would have been a catalyst for right procedures to have kicked in.
And it was. They changed personnel and they did some things different.
But they're back in the news now again.
Yeah, because the folks who were thought to be the change agents, it turned out were spending money inappropriately.
Again.
And so that kind of knocked the board on its side. And then when they looked at how they were actually administering some of the grants, there was extremely high overhead, and they actually, as I understand it, were sort of borrowing against the next grant to pay for administrative costs. And there was nothing illegal there, as far as I can tell, but as a result, the trust has become economically unviable. And the question is, do we inject some money into it and try to restart it again, or do we just say thank you and turn out the light and maybe start something up in the future? I actually would prefer...
Should there be a review? I mean, can you say with confidence that this was inept, that this was all ineptness and none of it spills over into the other realm?
Whatever the other realm means.
Well,
I know that
it's not so hypothetical. You and I have been around.
The Inspector General is, I'm told this was referred to the Inspector General back in January, and they're looking at it. There's that going on. But the concept behind the trust was a good one, and that is that you have this quasi-government entity that is raising money in the private sector, getting some dollars from the public sector, and then making grants to nonprofits to further different programs that would be good for children, some innovative programs. And losing the trust means that we've now lost that strategy.
But it seems like we've lost the small T trust in the big T trust.
Yeah.
And none of this is rocket science. I mean, there are people there are philanthropies all over, including in D.C., that manage to give out money in a way that's efficient, that's beneficial to the recipients, to the intended targets,
yes,
and doesn't raise this ongoing series of questions. I mean, the Harry Thomas thing was a long time ago.
Well, the Harry Thomas thing was criminal. That was embezzlement. And
if ever there was going to be an agency that had like the most sterling record, you'd think it would be one that had its reputation dragged through the mud.
Well, they should all have sterling records.
But you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. I think it's very unfortunate that we're pulling the plug on the trust. And I think it's a legitimate approach to pull the plug. I'd rather to see us, if we couldn't redouble our efforts in giving it more attention so that it could get back on its feet, but that's not going to happen.
And who decides all this?
It's a collective decision.
Something we can talk about next time.
Yes.
DC Council Chairman Phil Mendelson is with us on the first Thursday of every month. Always great having you here to be able to discuss important issues in depth. Thanks, as always, for your time.
Thank you.
An update on the hour's top stories and the Friday forecast. It's all coming your way next. And then, inside the vice presidential vetting process.